Hi, let's talk about writing. So writing is using knowledge and new ideas combined with language knowledge to create text. It involves a variety of processes like motor, cognitive, linguistic, affective, and executive processes. And the important thing to realize there that if a person has an area of difficulty in any of those, it could affect their ability to write. Writing is more abstract and decontextualized than conversation. If we think about the purpose of writing, we're communicating about things or ideas that aren't necessarily immediately present, and we're communicating with people who typically aren't immediately present. There are aspects to the writing process to think about: spelling, executive function, text construction, and memory. Let's talk about spelling first. It's quite interesting because it's actually mostly self-taught through trial and error. If we think about schooling, there's only about 4,000 words that are directly taught. So other than that, we figured it out on our own. And how do we do that? Well, mature spellers rely on memory, reading and spelling experience. So the more that you read and spell, probably the better you are at it. We use phonological, semantic, and morphological knowledge. So our knowledge of the sound structure of language, of how word parts go together, and of course the meaning of word parts to assist us in learning how to spell things. We use orthographic knowledge and mental grapheme representations, and that's referring to our actual knowledge of spelling and spelling patterns, so being able to remember what they look like. An analogy, we talked about this in terms of reading. So that's being able to recognize similar words and use them to help spell one another. Spelling competes with other aspects of writing for cognitive energy. This is really important to understand when you're working with people who have difficulties with spelling, because if I'm struggling to spell individual words, I have much less cognitive resources left over for all the other aspects of writing. So it can be a kind of a bottleneck that prevents me from maybe even expressing ideas that I could express if the spelling weren't getting in the way. Let's talk a little bit about writing development throughout the lifespan. So emerging and developing literacy early on, what happens? Well, first off, children in the beginning, they treat writing and speaking as two different systems. They have to learn how they're related. Writing overtakes speech as written sentences become longer and more complex. That is to say, there is a period of time where your written language is simpler than your spoken language, and then they become quite simple. And then as you begin to master the written language system, actually the complexity of written language overtakes that of spoken language. So we tend to use more advanced and formal structures in written language after a point of learning than we do in our spoken language. When we get better at writing, we're going to become more aware of our audience, and we'll start to target our writing to who it's meant to go to. So we'll do things like changing the syntax, the vocabulary, the themes, and the overall attitude of the writing to match the audience. Mature and skilled writers become consciously aware of what they're doing, so they gain additional control over the work. Adult writing typically contains longer and more complex sentences, uses more abstract nouns, more metalinguistic and metacognitive words like think, say, and know. There'll be literate vocabulary words, so these are more complex words that we tend to use in reading and writing that we just don't pull out in everyday conversational speech. We can talk a little bit about writing problems throughout the lifespan. We talked in reading about children who have language impairment. These children often have difficulties in writing as well, as you might have guessed. So some characteristics of their writing can include less writing overall. So reduced productivity, number of words, number of utterances, etc. So they're just writing less. Their writing may be less complex, and it could include more errors. They can have specific deficits in spelling. So for example, if they have difficulties with phonological structure and phonological processing, that can result in spelling difficulties. They may rely on visual matching and phoneme position to compensate for some of those sound letter difficulties. So they can come up with sometimes odd looking letter combinations that are based on some kind of a strategy of trying to match what things look like. Deficits in executive function are another area that can affect writing. So some children with learning disabilities, for example, may have difficulty planning their writing, and that might be related to language formulation. They might produce very little, and they might elaborate very little, so the writing looks very bare bones. They might not revise their work very well, so they might say it's not great, but they might not know how to do it, or they might not recognize that it's not their best work. They might not have enough skill to target their work to the audience. They might have difficulty detecting errors. and consequently they might have difficulty executing changes. So remember, we talked about that in reading. First, you have to be able to notice that there are difficulties before you can address them. We can talk about text generation. Children with language impairment might have difficulty understanding story structures. Remember, in reading, we talked about text grammars. Those equally come into play in writing. So if you have difficulty understanding how stories go together and how stories are made up, you're going to have trouble writing that as well. And it's true for the various types of text grammars. So let's use narratives as an example. So for children with learning disabilities, their narratives may be shorter, have less complex sentences. They might have fewer episodes, which is a meaningful chunk in a story. They may have fewer details. So again, it's that theme of being unelaborated. And they may fail to consider the needs of the listener. So for example, not providing enough information or using all pronouns instead of naming characters. Children with learning disabilities might have difficulty with morphological endings in writing, even when they use them in their speech. And that might have something to do with the overall load, the overall cognitive load of the writing activity. All right, let's take a break there and then come back to talk more about assessment.